Hitler burnt books and used a phrase that's very interesting when he was condemning a certain kind of art in Munich. He said, we have to get rid of the artistic criminal. In other words, the idea of an artist as a criminal because of the production of his art is an idea that I never heard before and since. In other words, there could be such a thing as an illegal song or an illegal book. And you have to understand that I come from a race of people for whom at one time in this country it was illegal to be taught to read. It was illegal and punishable by physical punishment and sometimes fatal punishment to learn how to read. And white people who taught black people how to read were taking the risk of being punished. So that is more than a secular event as far as I'm concerned. And I think the same sensibilities that informed those people to make it a criminal act for black people to read are the ancestors of the same people who are making it a criminal act for their own children to read. And I don't see a great deal of difference between that. There is some hysteria associated with the idea of reading that is all out of proportion to what is, in fact, happens when one reads. To deny a child an extraordinary book like Invisible Man, a classic, because of 3 phrases, is all but madness.
So we thought it was important to open the conversation with having you hear from Toni Morrison. We could set the conversation up in a number of ways, but the best way obviously is to hear from, I think as Tracy suggested, the Queen herself. So we're grateful for the technology to be able to do this work. As Asia indicated, my name is Dana Williams, and it's always a pleasure to be in the DC Public Library, in any library really. If you are like me growing up, the library was not just a place of refuge, but a place where you could allow your imagination to soar. So really excited to be here. Joining me this evening, we have A.J. Verdell, who is a professor at Morgan State University in creative writing, but also does incredible work in communities and has just told us she's just off of the train too, from the Schomburg Center in New York. So that just goes to show too how committed she is to Banned Book Suite, to DC Public Library, to the DMV, and of course AJ's Miss Chloe is one of the books that we will have available, the library will have available to you for the foundation. So please join me in welcoming AJ Verdell. And so much of what AJ outlines and Miss Chloe talks about that literary friendship. So we'll get to some of that after we talk about banned books as well. Also joining the panel tonight, Angela Mitchell, who is professor of English and at one time was director of African American Studies at Georgetown University. And just for as long as I have been an adult in the academy, a very wonderful colleague. And a fun fact is she was actually the external reader for my dissertation committee. So she couldn't shake me, even if she tried. But also a graduate of Howard University's PhD program. So we share not just an experience, but also, as I come to call her, a queen mother, Eleanor Traylor. So welcome, Angela Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also joining us, Evelyn Schreiber, who is professor of English at George Washington, or the George Washington University, a former president of the Toni Morrison Society, and that's also part of what got this group together too. We're all members of the Toni Morrison Society, and just to be clear, you don't have to be an academic to be a member of the Toni Morrison Society. A big part of that work was about libraries and communities. One of the birthday parties that Evelyn and I actually coordinated together for Miss Morrison was at the Library of Congress, because libraries were among her favorite places as well. So we feel like we're in really good company, and really grateful for this opportunity that the DC Public Library has given to us. We want to start really by thinking about what Morrison said in that clip, and I'm so glad that Ryan and the team put together a program that had artistic expression about books, but also that gave us artistic expression beyond the book. So the work that we saw Alexandria do on this stage today speaks specifically to that notion of the artist as criminal. I can see very easily the artistic production, the work that Alexandria and her colleagues do as criminal. Like, I can see someone saying, oh, that can get somebody free. You turn her singing. It reminded me of Paul Laurence Dunbar, like when Melinda sings, like, everybody else just be quiet, let's sit back and listen to Alex. That's kind of how we were, like, turn your mics off so we don't like make a mistake. And it's like, But AJ had her mic on, so she said, Anyway, so we are grateful for the work of the arts in general. But as you heard Morrison talk in that clip about or aligning the banning of books to the work of Hitler and to the work of fascist governments, what are your thoughts?
Well,
We don't like fascist government.
no. But I think the warning signs are everywhere at this point. We've got a divided country. We've got singled out groups for punishment. We've now, if you're going to start banning books, the censorship of one wing of political parties taking over in a way that what's lost is the free thinking and the ability to think for yourself. What's interesting about the book burnings in 1933, when Hitler first comes to power, is they were student organized. 34 universities, students organized book burning to get rid of the filth of, non-German literature, because they'd been infiltrated by the Nazi party, the Hitler Youth. So this is right from the beginning. They're changing the ideology with young people. So for someone at university to start burning books and reveling in it, this is scary. And I think banning books is really at the same, it's the same temper. And if we don't recognize it as that, then we're in trouble.
AJ, I think you were about to jump
Yeah,
into.
I mean, I'm with you about the singing and how, if you excite people, if you encourage people to come together to think about things, if they're not doing the things you want them to do, you can want to make that criminal if you're in power, and if you think people should do the things you think they should do instead of the things they think they should do. But part of it, especially listening, is that a DuBose Hayward song? Is that part of Porgy and Bess, right? Right, so it's the last day of summer, like today or yesterday, right? And so here's the summertime thing. And the summertime is a real fantasy, right? You're gonna be okay because mommy and daddy are here, except, right, when you're a slave kid, mommy and daddy are not here, right? You don't know where you are. You don't know where your parents are. And so part, I think, of the tendency to ban books is when you realize that the books are not contributing to the fairy tale that you want everybody to believe in. You want everybody to feel like they're safe and feel like they're in a country that cares about them, when in reality, you're in a country that hates you, right? And so when that becomes clear to you, and the books make it clear to you, which is certainly what Morrison's books do, they say, this is how black people live. Guess what? This is how black people live. And so it's scary, and it's not a fairy tale, and it's sad.
That, interestingly enough, is, I think, so critical to what happens in The Bluest Eye. For those of you who think about the book visually, too, it opens with that primer, like, here's the house, with Dick and Jane. And so it's readable until it gets to the point where it's not readable. It's not legible because it doesn't translate. That mythology doesn't translate from family to family. So I think part of what Morrison is clearly doing in that book is saying that this reality that you have assumed about what constitutes a family and goodness does not apply to everyone, and watch what I do with it. Watch what the implications are, the dangers of it, but then for those who don't succumb to the danger, the way that they can critique it, which is I think why it's also important that we have Pecola and Claudia. Like we hear both of those voices so that it's not just one place or one or the other. So we wanted to talk a little bit about teaching and banned books. And Evelyn, I know you are teaching a class at GW on race and identity in Toni Morrison's work. So how do your students think about the book as one that was banned, is banned, and the censorship issues that kind of go along with it? And even before you tell us about that, you'll also tell us a little bit about like what are the kind of politics, like what are the most common reasons given for banning books? How do things get on that list anyway?
I don't know how they can. Well, school districts, different PTA meetings, maybe coming from the parents as opposed to the top down from the governor, goes bottom up. I don't know why. A student comes home and complained in Virginia. A student came home and said he was traumatized, a white student, for reading Beloved. And the mother went in and said, you can't do this to my child. You can't traumatize my child about reading about what we it's history. One thing my student said, I said, what do you think? He says, well, they're banning the books because we're not even teaching the history. Beloved shouldn't be hard for anyone to read if you've already had American history and you know about it. It's very hard to read if you don't know about it. So I think people who don't want change or people who feel threatened, my students, when I asked them who would ban a book, they said, oh, it's just to protect white people. It's white supremacy. People don't want to lose control. They want to be in control of what you think and how the world looks. They want the white picket fence at the beginning, but they don't want the rest of the bluest eye that comes with it.
Do they have any particular thoughts about the bluest eye specifically and what might have made it complicated as they were thinking about race and identity as a course on Morrison altogether? They're a sophisticated reader class, of course, because they're college students and they've signed up voluntarily for this class. But as you were talking to them about banned books in general, anything stick out for you?
Just that they think of what's lost if we don't read The Bluest Eye. They said you don't see how traumatized the black children are or the black community. I mean, everyone in the book has really if you think of Pauline at the movies, she can't even go to the movies without feeling that she's lesser because she wants that white ideal. It's the bluest eye that keeps Pecola yearning to change who she is. So the fact that your own self doesn't feel safe in the white environment because that white gaze is manipulating everything you do, you miss that white gaze and the power of it if you're not reading the book. And so banning the book does a disservice to the reality of the culture that we live in.
Yeah. As we think about the reasons that people give, I think it's critical that we make that connection that one reason that people might give might be obscenity or about concerns about exposure to the ways that it might traumatize one's imagination. But I think the connection that you're making there, just in terms of like the preservation of whiteness, is at the center. And even as Asia was telling us about the books that are most banned, they have to do with racial identity and or sexual identity, both of which are about also preserving a certain kind of heteronormative notion of what whiteness is. So those are complicated ways to think about. It's more than I just don't want this book in particular. And the thing that Morrison talks about, the one that we won't necessarily see the clip of, where she said when they told her that her book had been banned in prisons because it might incite a riot, and she's like, oh, my book could do that? Okay, that's a thing that I want to do. So it wasn't something that she leaned back from at all. It was something that she absolutely leaned into. Angela, and I know you thought a lot about too what's at stake for banning books, and this book in particular. So you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and following up on what Evelyn said and what you just said, And to echo Sweet Honey, we who believe in freedom know, right, that democracy is one of the best tools that we have for freedom. And to ban books, to censor, right, because that's what it's a form of censorship, that serves as an anti-democratic strategy. And it has political aims, right? The what I think of as the decentering of whiteness, for example, I think will always elicit response. And by that I mean, when I teach, for example, The Bluest Eye, it is a narrative that is suffused with whiteness, right? But it's whiteness that is pervasively pernicious on Black children, on Black families, on Black cultures, communities. And that's what we get the opportunity to interrogate in that particular novel. That's also what allows others to become defensive because of that interrogation, right? You know, I think it's interesting to think about how that concern of banning was deep for Ms. Morrison. We see this clip from 1982 in which she's talking about, you know, the issue of banning. Fast forward to the 90s, at the convocation at Howard University in 1995, she outlines the steps, as she sees them, to fascism. And a part of that has to do with the control of knowledge, right? Because that is one of the ways that you can control the populace. It's a wonderful speech. YouTube it or just Google. You can read it as well, because her words are beautiful when she's speaking them as well as when you read them. And then in 2009, she edits Burn This Book, right, which is a collection about the banning of books. And in her introduction, which is entitled Peril, and you can find that as well in that collection or in the most recent collection of her nonfiction, The Source of Self-Regard. So it's the opening essay, just a paragraph, because it's Morrison. We all know nations that can be identified by the flight of writers from their shores. These are regimes whose fear of unmonitored writing is justified because truth is trouble. It is trouble for the warmonger, the torturer, the corporate thief, the political hack, the corporate justice system, and for the comatose public. Unpersecuted, unjailed, unharassed writers are trouble for the ignorant bully, the sly racist, and the predators feeding off the world's resources. The alarm, the disquiet writers raise is instructive because it is open and vulnerable, because it, if unpoliced, it is threatening. Therefore, the historical suppression of writers is the earliest harbinger of the steady peeling away of additional rights and liberties that will follow. The history of persecuted writers is as long as the history of literature itself, and the efforts to censor, starve, regulate, and annihilate us are clear signs that something important has taken place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so in those moments, in those moments where we have these eruptions, we know that something important has taken place, that power has been challenged, and that truth is troubled.
I think that's so critical for so many reasons when we think about how book banning happens. And I know we were talking a little bit earlier interestingly enough, I think we all feel this way as literature professors. Part of what we're also trying to do is to insist on like not banning books. So I can remember, and I was joking about this earlier in the media training that we had to do as new chairs at Howard. It was like, tell us the things that you are comfortable talking about so that we can have you, you know, face the public and, you know, do your work in DC in the community, and tell us the things you don't want to talk about. And I was like, I don't ever want to talk about book banning and censorship because I'll never be reasonable about that. I think that's like, I can't be a civil person, and I believe in civil discourse. So I'm joking about it now because I'm like, I'm more mature now. At the time I was much younger, like I dare a reporter to ask me. But and the short version of the story too is it was a setup. It was the media training there was, don't ever tell a reporter what you don't want to talk about, because when they get you on camera, that's what they're going to ask you to talk about if things fall apart. So they want the shock value. So it wasn't even about, I was like, oh, and so she's like, so you're perfectly capable of talking about it. And now that you know that there's this thing that you feel some kind of way about, that's the thing you should go home thinking about. And it's interesting that we've all thought so much about censorship. AJ was telling us as we were talking about it, like, well, sometimes book banning works, but there are other times that it fails. So tell us a little bit about what makes it work and when does it fail?
Yeah, well, it works when you control the budget, right? When you say, I want these books banned and I'm not giving you money to have them unbanned, right? Now, when you ban books, though, you do cause people to talk about it. Here we are. And it's been talked about all week. We have a fancy week now for banned books, right? And so that is a way in which it fails. But the scary part is the math, right? Like, let's say that they were successful at banning Morrison in schools. Well, in 25 years, nobody would know about her.
Yeah.
Right? Because we'd all be old and doddering and nobody'd be listening to us. And the people behind us wouldn't have read her, so they don't know what's there. And I'm sort of convinced that the people who want to ban her are not reading her as well. But I will say this. Banning books is part of Negro erasure. And Negro erasure has been going on forever. They stand in our face and say, you are not experiencing what you are experiencing. Instead, you are experiencing what we tell you you are experiencing, right? So you get whipped. No, you're just being punished. You're just learning what to do. You get sold away from your mother. No, you're a child, you're property. This is what happens to you. So things are going on and people are denying them in your face. But once we learn to read, which is what Morrison is talking about, once you have the power to decode, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. It's over.
Yeah.
So that's the way it fails.
It does. I think you're absolutely right. It does fail when writers write and when readers read.
Yep.
It absolutely fails. It fails when systems say, no, you don't get to pick for us. It fails when, for Banned Books Week, a public library system where your tax dollars contribute to that, say not only are we going to talk about that book, but we're going to put those books in your hand and invite you to read them. And if you just think about the juxtaposition of a library buying books to give away, like they want to get you in here to read the books, and like almost it's a better thing than sugar in terms of an addiction. We want you here, but it fails when library systems have foundations that say, no, we want to put this book in your hands so that you read it and you tell other people about it as well. And it can be politicized in so many ways. Talk a little bit about, and this is just kind of open before, and we will certainly open the floor for questions and comments from the floor. But we also want to take advantage of this opportunity just to talk about the Bluest Eye, not just in the context of banned books or not just in the context of the week in Morrison, but what works, what's important about the Bluest Eye that makes it a book that everybody should read, whether it was on the list or not. So.
Well, I think the notion of love, which Morrison carries through a lot of her works, Pecola says, how do you get someone to love you? And her other friend, young friend, said, we don't know, we haven't found that out yet. And this idea of Pecola being totally incapable of having a lovable self from everyone in her community from her parents to teachers to her friends. And she won't exist unless she has these blue eyes, and it makes her lovable. So I think the idea of community that supports or fails its members is important in The Bluest Eye, as well as Morrison wanted to focus on children who are often overlooked, and what is childhood like, and how does childhood prepare you for the world and the adult world that you'll enter into.
The love is never better than the lover, right? That's a line that preaches, you know, and I tell my students, you remember that. Whenever you start querying why X, Y, and Z happen, the love is never better than the lover. And so I think, you know, Morrison does a wonderful, wonderful service, if you will, in helping us to think more energetically about something that seems very commonplace. I too think that centering the story of a young black girl is so crucial and so key, especially in 1970, right? She has often said in interviews that she wanted to write a story that she wanted to read that wasn't available to her. And we know that much of The Bluest Eye is not autobiographical, but is certainly informed by her own life growing up in Lorain, Ohio, in a very close-knit family. I think The Bluest Eye allows us to have a meditation on a particular period in American history as well, you know, mid-century, 20th century, in a particular context, with the material conditions of that moment being very present. I'm smiling under my mask because I'm thinking about how Morrison says in The Pieces I Am, which is the documentary that came out a couple of years ago now, that if you haven't seen, please see. But she talks about how she didn't know if people understood that people just didn't have a lot, and that trying to get ahead wasn't the goal. It was to have your family, to have enough to eat, to be indoors, to use a metaphor from The Bluest Eye, and that poverty wasn't demonized in the way that it has become. So I think it's really interesting to think about that text in the context of the historicizing that it does in that moment.
So I was thinking about this panel earlier today, and I was like, when is the moment going to be when the scholars depart? And I'm sitting there as a writer. So I'm going to say this as a writer. The Bluest Eye is a lot about transparency. Like, it starts with these people who live in a storefront. And I remember being young, reading that, going, who lives in a storefront? What does it mean to live in a storefront? And then as you develop as a writer, you realize what it means is that people can look in on you. And that's what Morrison was trying to deliver with the storefront, that this is a story about looking in on a kind of family that you wouldn't normally see. And in this family, there are 3 girls. There's Pecola, who's pretty much crazy. So if you want to read about crazy people, you can read The Bluest Eye. And then there's these 2 girls who are sisters, Frida and Claudia.
Yep.
And they're sort of goodish girls. Their parents are trying to make them what all our parents try to make us, right? Know how to wear a dress, know how to cross your legs, read, go to school, you know, all that stuff. But as a reader, you get to find yourself in this crew of characters. I remember reading it thinking, well, I'm not Pecola for sure, because I'm not crazy. But am I Claudia or am I Frida? And the thing is, then you start realizing, hey, I'm identifying with a book. which I've never done before. I used to watch Julia. Remember Julia used to come on one night a week and you go scrambling. Y'all don't know, but Julia was the most beautiful black nurse in the history of America. And she came on TV once a week. And just like Oprah used to say, black people on television. That's what we used to say in the house. Black people. And so you come running to the television. Anyway, you identified with Julia, except she was pretty and she was grown and she was making money. And Corey was a boy, so you could look at The Bluest Eye and say, hey, I might be like one of these people. So the whole idea of transparency, the idea of starting with the white picket fence and the see Dick run and turning the transparency into the cluster F that it becomes before it becomes a black story. And, I think that poverty being demonized is a result of race not being. I mean, race is still demonized except with people who are colored. Black people are like, what you talking about, right? You can't demonize race anymore the way it was just cut and dry before. So now you can't demonize race. Well, let's make them all poor and say it's their fault they're poor, and now we'll demonize poverty. So The Bluest Eye is worth reading because your vocabulary is going to improve. You're going to see 3 black girls in the middle of a very important story, and you'll see a genius writer writing early in her career. And as I tell my students all the time, if you like a writer, you got to read the early work, because that's the only way you can see what they're doing.
Yeah, you see that movement, that growth, that development, but you also see those sustained themes that are there, and the range of characters. I'm thinking about Maureen, who everybody, if you weren't Maureen, you knew Maureen, like you knew a person who teased people, or who like pretended to have all of the answers or not to have to study. And then you also learn the background of these adult characters to understand what makes people who they are. So one of the things that I think was like really, really remarkable for me the first time I read it was we're learning so much about the interiority of these characters. We know what makes them tick, even if it's something that takes you left, as happens with Pecola. We understand why she wants those blue eyes and what she thinks that will afford her in some ways. So we have one more clip from Miss Morrison talking about banned books, where she, just to set it up just a little bit, it's parents in public schools, where she says, sure, you have the right to say that your kid shouldn't do something, but you don't have the right to say what my kid can read. So let's take a look.
Parents have a right to restrict books in the same way, under the same circumstances under which they are read in the home. They have a right to tell a child their own children what to read, and exercising some parental control over a minor. They don't have the right to tell my children what to read, which is what happens when you ban a book publicly. You're not only exerting your rights over your own children, you are imposing restrictions on mine. So the nature of a public school cannot support that.
So it's important, again, because she says, listen, you have the right, absolutely, in public schools and libraries to say what you let your kid pick up off of the shelf. And I think that's really important. Like, making decisions about what books to read with your children is critical. And you should read them with them. And that's one of the strategies that we actually suggest. There's a program with the Morrison Society, Language Matters, which teaches public school teachers how to talk about certain books at that level, but then also how to read the book with your young person, so that it isn't this kind of difficult thing. So that element is there. But what also came across in that clip for me was just that personality, where she says, you have the right, but you do not have the right to tell my kid what to read. So I would like to hear us just talk a little bit about what that kind of personality was and did, and how it showed up in the literature, because at different points with the Morrison Society, she came to all of the conferences, and I think at different points the three of us had, I'm meaning Evelyn and Angie, having kind of distant relationships With her, and most of them, to be quite honest, was kind of like, no, yes, or no, and until like the energy was calm enough, and you could tell, all right, this is where she is, like in her thinking and her engagement at this level. But that personality was always commanding because it was also so intelligent. And I included the three of us in AJ because AJ and Morrison had a different kind of relationship, a very close friendship as well. So we'll wrap just a little bit with talking about what kind of mind, that dancing mind, if you will, makes a book like The Bluest Eye and all books. And then we'll open the floor for questions. So AJ, you want to start for us?
Yeah, I mean, Morrison, one, was a genius, and, you know, genius is incredibly powerful, but only if you accept it, right?
And she leaned into it.
She leaned into her genius. Most of us, we have inklings of genius, and we're like, oh my God. But no, she was very aware of her capability and her power, and she did not relinquish it ever at all in any way I saw her. She thought she was most powerful as a writer, and I think we all agree with that. And so she gave her writing tremendous priority and tremendous space in her life, and it was, you know, the thing. But I think watching that power is amazing. I mean, it teaches you the power of brevity. Like it's you're much more powerful if you just say no than if you just if you explain, right? You learn no is a gift you can give yourself. But also she had ways, like I'm riding in the car on the way here today, and I'm listening to the music of Dominique, my assistant, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. And I had said to Morrison one time about how the music was just driving me crazy, and she's like, the next generation always hates the music of the prior generation. So stop whining,
Yeah.
right? So she was very brief. She could just slice through bullshit like really quickly, and I always found it amazing. And I try to emulate that. I'm not very good. I'm not very good at that. I'm actually much more chatty, and she was just brief and cutting. So before I finish being chatty, I just want to say that Morris and I, one of our things that we shared the most was that our first jobs were in libraries. And this library right here was my stomping ground, because I could come down here on the train by myself. I didn't need anybody to come with me. So I did a lot of maturing in this very library. So I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian. This is my dad right here, third generation. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be talking about Morrison here. And I'm happy to say that I think a lot of what you get, that you are able to articulate, you will get in the library.
Yep.
So get your ASS to the library.
I'm thinking of, the library staff's like, yeah. Minus the expletive. I'm thinking of that moment in The Pieces I Am where she says, oh, I'm very smart in the morning. In the afternoon, and so that kind of confidence was always there too, like being clear about where your gifts are and when they come, and the willingness and the discipline to wake up and get
in it.
Yep.
Staying right in it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Angie.
Clarity, I think, is a key word in thinking about, you know, Ms. Morrison. Clarity of vision, clarity of purpose, clarity of existence, right? Hers was a capacious mind. The range of works that she read, because quiet as it's kept, you know, writers are readers.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so, you know, just taking a look through those many wonderful interviews that we have still, a wonderful treasure trove of her life, of her mind. Those give a very interesting insight into who she was and what she thought. A very inquisitive mind. What are those things called? The mystery drama things like CSI, kind of. What do we call those?
Crime shows.
Procedurals.
Procedure.
Okay, yeah, she was a big fan of those, right? Anything that really captivated her attention, her intellect, seemed to be important. And one of the things that I've thought about in some work I'm doing on her is just how do I want to say this? How centered she was. You know, the kind of fearlessness that she had, first in her family to go to college, to go and do it big, too. I mean, she was a hit at Howard. Okay. As she says in the pieces,
Intentionally.
I am, what did she say? She says, she was loose.
I was loose.
We're not quite sure what she meant, but we have a good inkling of that. You know, on the homecoming court, right? Her involvement with the theater, and I think all of those things shaped her in such a way, and to the self-confidence that she had in order to be who she was, to be in the spaces that she not only just lived in, but excelled in.
Yeah.
You know, first senior black woman editor at Random House. You know, I mean, it's an incredible life. It is an incredible life and a wonderful example for us to think about, and if we are thinking about the possibilities of where we can go.
Yes. Evelyn.
I forget which interview it was, but she said something like, "Well, I'm gallant," you know, and she was elegant. You know, she owned it. But she was, for me, the most down to earth, honest person in dealing. I mean, she was real, and you could have discussions, and her mind was interested in everything. So she knew about everything. She'd read about everything. But I think it was her generosity of spirit with all of the members of the society and scholars. I mean, it's true. She said at one point, "Well, you all are my legacy. You know, how people are going to read my books is going to be molded by your classes." And but she was interested in our students and what they were saying. So just her brilliance was always there. But that generosity of spirit, which you might not expect from someone who is up here in our minds, but she's really down here with us also.
No, I agree with that completely. I can remember having an early conversation with her about the project that I'm working on and her editorship at Random House, and just like kind of quietly saying, "Yeah, I'm thinking about doing this." And so she's like, "Oh, if you need anything, let me know." And I was like, "What?" Okay, yeah, sure, I'd like to. So she's like, "Yeah, because nobody talks about that." So that generosity was there, and the intentionality around wanting people to read her books. Every time we had a young reader circle, she would sit there with the little kids, like, "What's your name?" Like going through the whole, just complete engagement, because she understood that without readers, the work that she did would just like sit on shelves and not mean anything in particular. So
Well,
we want to go ahead.
I just want to say that I think Morrison really wanted people to understand you have to own what you are.
Yes.
Yeah.
So like if you discover that you're good at something, or you like
Yeah.
something, or you want to do something, you should own it and step into it, because that's the only way that it develops. And that's what she did. She owned her skills, she owned her genius, she owned her black womanhood, she owned her celebrity, she owned her power.
Yeah. So we have some time to take questions from the floor, and I think there is a microphone that's going around, and if you would be so kind as to use it, because we're streaming, we want to make sure that the audience can hear as well.
Yes, I'm G-Rod, the real one, and that is definitely sometimes messed with. J-E-R-O-D space B-A-L-T-Z, however you want to pronounce it. Banned books, I believe that there should be levels of restrictions like movies where parents can then possibly have their children or watch over for certain levels. There are certain things, and somebody can block this out, but the Anarchist Cookbook does not need to be out there, all right? Because I don't need my like a whole building blown up by some child that learned that. But for the most part, learning lessons are good. And the only thing that happens also is wrong facts, bad, right? That's libel. and shouldn't necessarily be out. That doesn't even make it to print type thing. But fiction that is possible and good is, and then the restrictions of any of that, so that some child isn't reading about nasty gangsters and then wanting to run out and do something, and at least his parents explain that to him and stuff, is good. I have never heard about Toni Morrison ever getting banned. I just read Song of Solomon and have known her for like over 20 years, and she's like a Nobel laureate. So I have no idea what any of that is going on. But God bless, amen, don't mess with the U.S., and, be good. 1E, no breaking and entering unless you're federally affiliated officially.
All right, thank you. So that's an interesting kind of segue again into like that conversation I was saying earlier about not wanting to have the censorship ban books conversation because of conversations like where people will say, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And I'm thinking like, yeah, you're going to give me an example of something that logically is highly problematic, but you have to count on adults to be adults. Mm-hmm. I remember teaching middle school, small Quaker school, greatest education experience that I think that I had, because I went to a public school, all black public school, like my whole life. So my comprehension of what it meant to sit and do what people said was very different from these little young people calling me by my first name. So that was the first kind of like breakdown of like equality and what it means to be equal. But by the end of that period, by the end of that year, if a student wanted to sit on the floor and do whatever, I began to understand what it means to treat a person genuinely as an equal. I say all of that to say the parent, 2 black kids at the school, one of the parents, the kid had been adopted by, a black kid adopted by a white family, and said, well, I have some concerns about having, you're having my son read this Nathan McCall makes me want to holler because my fear is he'll read it and only do like the gangster stuff. And not do the stuff that Nathan McCall becomes like though. And so I was like, this is why I should never talk about this, because I'm going to call her stupid. But you can't, right? You have to say your responsibility as the parent and the adult is to read the thing alongside so that you all can have a conversation. And if you want to abdicate that responsibility to me, okay. But let's say that.
Right.
Don't say don't have my kid read this book. Say,
Right.
will you read this book with my kid?
Right.
Because I'm not willing to do that.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right.
Hi, this is more like a comment or whatever. So the banned books and the CRT and all of this is kind of interconnected. And one of the things that I thought about is that CRT has always existed because when I was growing up, who wrote the books and who were the books about?
That's
So
right.
wasn't that a form of CRT?
Yeah.
So now all of this stuff is coming up and I'm like, well, they've been CRTing us all our life. And only a few of us had gone to schools that had African American. I mean, I grew up in the early 70s and we had it in elementary, a history class, Black American history in Detroit, Michigan. And but other than that, we've been learning the history of the Pilgrims and all of this stuff, and I'm thinking like this is like reverse psychology or something. The CRT, the banned books.
Well, it's us owning what they have previously owned. And so for them, they think we can own this again. I always say they're like, we stole this country fair and square and we're not giving it back. Right?
Yeah.
So, so the point is, yes, they have been teaching us this race set of lies, and now we know that they're lies, and it's not, they can't go back. So they can try to ban the books, and if we let them, I mean, that's one of the things about the adults. I mean, in the middle of all this stuff, if the adults would take responsibility and make PG books and R books and whatever, they could do that. Nobody would really complain about that. But they're not sensible enough as adults to do that. They just want to stand around and scream.
And it becomes a proxy.
Right.
And I think that's what Angie and Evelyn were both suggesting here, that the banned book or CRT becomes a proxy for how do I preserve whiteness in a moment of demographic anxiety. Like before, when there were fewer people that I had to deal with this about, then it was just like, all right, if you want to do that on your own time, that's fine. But now that there is a majority, the goal has to shift.
Right.
And as you were saying, stealing something fair and square, like we don't want to play by those rules that we made for you anymore. We're going to change those as well. So any closing remarks? I'm sorry, you had a question, like right here.
Yeah, so I was introduced to the Bluest Eye as a high school student in Prince George's County, went again, read it again in college under the lens of Black masculinity. And now I'm a DCPS teacher, and I teach the Bluest Eye at an old boys school here in the city. And my question is, what do you all believe is most significant in the introduction of the character Charlie Breedlove to a group of young men who are still shaping, finding, and understanding their own selves? What does he offer to them? And just I have some ideas, but I want to hear yours. So if you can speak to his character specifically, and maybe around the idea of Black masculinity.
So I love Charlie because his name is spelled like I used to say Charlie about the man down the street. Y'all remember Charlie Rich? And so I was like, whoa, does she know Charlie? I was like 12. But anyway, okay, so here's the thing about Charlie. Charlie's nobody without, what's the wife's name?
Pauline.
Pauline, right? And I actually asked Farrah this. I sent her a text, would you describe Pauline as disabled? Which we never talk about.
Yeah.
But Pauline is, she's one of two Morrison characters who has one leg is much shorter than the other. So she's kind of limping throughout the whole story, back to the transparency. See, when you're a writer, people can't limp unless there's a reason for them to be limping, right? So anyway, she limps throughout the whole story, and Charlie has chosen her, or ended up with her, and he's trying to express the same kind of power as a man that most of us women view as toxic, but no man calls it toxic, right? We have rape culture all over the United States, but we don't call it rape culture, which is all it is. So Charlie is a man who wanted to be partnered. He chose her or settled for that. He cannot be the man he thinks he should be. And that's kind of the story that they want for African American men. And Morrison is saying to me, here's an example of what that looks like. He's shamed when he's young so that the later experiences that he's having are informed by that first one where those people found him in the cornfield and all that. So he's really tortured, I think. And that's the way I approach Charlie.
And I think it's important to focus on the backstory that she provides, that Morrison provides. It would be different if we just saw Charlie in that terrible moment when he assaults Piccola, right? But that's not what we are given. We are given as much of his background as we are of Pauline's. The McTeers, I'm always curious when I read The Bluest Eye to know more about their backstory, right? But we don't get that, and I think for several reasons. But with Charlie, the fact that he was deposited on a trash heap, right? When he goes to his father is more interested in the game that he is playing. The one stability that he has is Aunt Jimmy, right, passes away. The scene with Darlene and his first sexual encounter becomes it becomes a metaphoric raping of him because of the white gays, the white hunters, who with gun in hand threaten him. So you have all of that. And so I think what is helpful in talking about young men, as you have in your classes, how the circumstances of our lives can shape us in ways that we aren't even aware of, but that we also need to interrogate and see what is going on in those moments, right? In other words, he doesn't have that opportunity. There's no one for him to talk to. And I think by having the book, it provides space for readers, such as your students, that then have the opportunity to talk about what is going on in their own lives that may be affecting them in very personal and psychological ways that they have no way of engaging. That's one of the things I think that literature allows. You know, James Baldwin, who I think of as a friend of Ms. Morrison's mind in so many ways, as she says in Beloved, you think your heartache is singular in the world, but then you read, right? And that's the essence, I think, for the power of reading and what it can provide for the individual. It's not prescriptive.
And I'm thinking toxic masculinity for Charlie comes out of a toxic, traumatic life. I mean, everything in his world has been toxic to him. And I always look at how he started out as a good kid. He had an after-school job, and he had these two role models, Aunt Jimmy and Blue, and he's trying to develop, and he picks a partner, and it moves, you know, the movement from the south to the north, everything falls apart for him. But he never had any good nourishing from, I think about when Setha gives birth to Denver, and they stand on the shore, two throwaway women who have done something and done it well. And that's Charlie. I mean, he doesn't do it well. But there are reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it may be an over romanticization of it, but I am optimistic enough, as much as realistic enough too, to invite them to create a world where Charlie can be somebody else, and where Piccola doesn't have to want blue eyes. Like, that's part of the responsibility of, you know, teachers, to invite students to become not just readers, but to do the work that literature invites us to do, so that they can see themselves as enacting a world that where Charlie gets to stay on a particular path. It's been a wonderful conversation. You've been, of course, a wonderful audience. Please join me in thanking AJ, Angie, and Evelyn.
Thank you.
And of course, the DC Library team, who, you know, just has
Thank
been
you
working
so
so
Yes.
hard. I think we're closing, Ryan. Are we going to close with Morrison as well?
One more clip.
Yes.
Well, I don't suppose we should wait until we are arrested, as they are in other countries. I think history has always proved that books are the first plane on which certain kinds of battles are fought. And the fact that they're being removed from the schools is less dramatic and painful, perhaps, as being exiled from one's country or arrested. But I don't think we should wait for the blood before we take a stand on what is obviously political control of a certain art form.
Please give it up to our wonderful, wonderful panelists and hosts. Oh my gosh. Such an extraordinary conversation. Thank you so much for enlightening about Toni Morris. The last song I would like to leave you all with is entitled I Too Sing America, which is written by an African-American composer, Margaret Bonds, which she sets the text to Langston Hughes' I Too Sing America. And the words simply say, I too sing America. I am the darker brother, sister. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh, and I eat well and go strong. Tomorrow, I'll sit at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too darker sister. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll sit at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed